Thank you for joining us for this brief tour of Fort Missoula and a discussion of the 1918 flu. In the next few minutes, we'll look at the nature of wartime and how the crowded barracks at Fort Missoula and elsewhere in the United States affected the spread of influenza during the 1918 outbreak.
Hi, I'm Kristjana Education Director here at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, and with me is my wonderful AmeriCorps leader, Emily. Today, we decided we would spend some time as socially distanced as possible with our masks on to talk about the 1918 flu. During one of our Facebook Lives earlier, a couple people asked how was it in Missoula during the flu, and we thought that we would show you some of Fort Missoula and talk about the flu and how it relates to Fort Missoula. So, Emily, how does Fort Missoula relate to the flu in Missoula?
So we want to start our 1918 flu story here at the fort, specifically because the soldiers played a big part in contributing to the spread of the flu. They were living in tight quarters, they were coming in from all over, so it was kind of like a really big petri dish.
Yeah,
for
like
the
an
flu.
incubation space.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And you may hear certain stories like that elsewhere around the United States and looking at Europe as well. It all has to do with those close quarters. So we're out here in the middle of the parade grounds that was built part of the 1910 remodel. So you can see our officers row behind us there, and off in that direction we have the barracks. And in a little while we'll take you to some other spots that are important at Fort Missoula from this time period. So thanks for joining us. Our next stop, we're standing outside of the post hospital. You find that way back in October 7th of 1918, the Missoulian posted an article that 25 men were quarantined from the fort. So Emily, would you read that little section?
Yeah. 25 enlisted men in training at Fort Missoula were placed in the hospital at the post last night and quarantined in the belief that the men may have Spanish influenza. The men placed in the hospital were all examined upon their return from their usual Sunday off, which they had passed in the city. Though cases are slight, and it may be that they developed into nothing more than grippe, officers at the fort said last night.
So we've got one of the earlier description of the Spanish influenza or the 1918 flu in Missoula. The first cases are found out here at Fort Missoula, but as you noted there, Emily, they had just returned from their usual Sunday off, so you can imagine if these guys were all sick and they'd been out cavorting around town, that might have started some of the spread into the regular Missoula population. For our next stop, we're standing outside of the motor pool yard that was used in part by the Student Army Training Corps at Fort Missoula.
And Kristjana, what is the Student Army Training Corps?
The Student Army Training Corps is kind of a little bit like we might think of ROTC now. It was a way for students to stay in school but then also receive military training. So there were two different units, an A and a B unit. The A unit was mostly stationed at University of Montana, and the B unit was out here at Fort Missoula learning skills like mechanics and radio operation and cartography and other things like that that were trades but then would have been useful for the military as well as in later life. And remember, this is all happening in the middle of or towards the end of World War I. So there was a lot of interest in serving their country as well. So the folks that were in the Student Army Training Corps were interacting on a regular basis here at Fort Missoula with some of the soldiers that we talked about earlier. So those 25 that were infected and quarantined on October 7th may have had some contact with the folks that were also students here. And in fact, we find in the Missoulian, the first recorded death in Missoula was on October 12th, and it was a man named George Bonewitz. He was a soldier in training here at Fort Missoula. The next day, there were over 109 cases in Missoula reported to be infected with influenza. So for our next stop, we are here at the Post Cemetery at Fort Missoula. Emily, have you been out here before?
I have not been out here.
Okay, so we have folks that are buried here from the Frontier Military Fort, and then you can still be buried here if you have a connection to the military. But the family that we're going to be talking about right now is the Morgan family. So we're out here talking about Helen and George Morgan, her son, because they're pretty exemplary of the situation that happened all over the United States, but certainly here in Missoula, where they had a connection to the fort but they also lived in town and ended up contracting influenza during October of 1918. So we didn't know a lot about them, but Marcia Porter is a great researcher, and she was able to find obituaries and death certificates and marriage certificates, so we can kind of build on that to tell their story. And we know that Helen was married to Joseph Morgan, and they had a son named George. Now, unfortunately, Helen's husband never really got a chance to get to know his son because he was in California when the baby was born. When he found out that the baby was born and that was then sick, he was able to be given a furlough to come back to Fort Missoula, and he arrived the day before George Morgan passed away. And in the obituary, it says here, the 16-day-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Morgan, who died of influenza at the family home, was buried yesterday afternoon in the military cemetery at Fort Missoula. Mr. Morgan is a private in the United States Army at San Pedro, California, and was granted furlough, which enabled him to reach his home in the city one day before the death of his son. His wife, who is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. G.S. Dillon of this city, is very ill with influenza. And then we find out that his wife, Helen Morgan, actually passed on November 2nd, so just a few days later. And these are the types of stories that we find all over the United States and abroad because of this influenza. We'll talk a little bit more in our Facebook Live about why there was this spike in deaths of young and potentially healthy people. But it's important to remember that these stories are in our cemeteries, and that's just one example, is the Morgan family.